All right, this song has played now 100 times. I've heard this song 100 times, and I have to thank I wish I could thank the artist, but to be honest, there wasn't any artist connected to it. It was open source music, but whoever did create this, shout out and big love to you, because it has been the theme song that has guided this podcast for now what is the 100th episode. I cannot believe that I have had over, to be honest, 100 conversations. It's actually technically 101. One did not get produced, but technically it is just the 100th. And I cannot wait for today's conversation and this really special, exciting, motivating, inspiring conversation that's going to happen today with some dear friends of mine and colleagues and friends and co-authors of what is going to be an amazing tool for educators in this world, because we all know that it's rocky right now, but we're going to talk about all of that, but we're also going to talk about at the end why this book is going to be so important and the light that is in the midst of this darkness that we are experiencing as educators. So without further ado, I am Mathew Portell. I am the host of this podcast, and I can assure you probably have heard my voice before, but I am just excited to be part of this author team. I am a former principal and now principal coach. I get the honor of coaching principals every single day, next to them in the midst of what we now are experiencing in so many different places and spaces. And what an honor it is to be able to stand next to principals when they're in those midst of struggle, and also when they're in the midst of celebration. And I've truly enjoyed being back in a school setting with principals. I'm going to turn it over to one of my other co-authors and let her introduce herself to you. So Dr. Julie Nicholson, if you will introduce yourself, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and so esteemed to be here with all of my co-authors and everybody who's joining the podcast today. So yes, I'm Julie, and I'm coming to you from the Bay Area. I actually started my career as a teacher in preschool and then public school. I was a kindergarten teacher for a number of years, but more recently I've been a professor in a school of education in Oakland at Mills College, which is now merged. It's Mills College at Northeastern. And so I do a lot of work in school districts. Right now, actually, I'm working mostly with a lot of principals, superintendents, teachers on the transition to pre-K coming into the public school system. I just wrote a book with some colleagues on that, Principals as Early Learning Leaders. And then recently, I started as Vice President of Implementation and Impact for a social impact nonprofit children's funding project. So it's great to be here. We can't hear you, Matthew.
Oh, I am so sorry. I hit the mute button on my recording device. Hey, those people who are alive, you got to see it. Those people who are not, you didn't. But big shout out to the pre-K folks in the world. I had 4 classes of pre-K in my building, and I loved the pre-K teachers because it's a special human that can teach pre-K. So shout out to you pre-K teachers. I am not one of them, but I appreciate the work you do. Ingrid Cockhren, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for the invite, and I'm excited to be here and talk to this awesome audience of yours. I am CEO of Paces Connection, but when I think about kind of my school-focused career, it really started with family engagement. And I used to be a preschool teacher. I actually was a director of a preschool here in Nashville, Tennessee. But my work has it started with early childhood education, early childhood development as well. And now I am a child development and developmental psychology professor, adjunct. And I also am a trauma-informed schools consultant. So I am really enmeshed in trauma-informed schools in varying degrees. And it is one of the aspects of my work that I appreciate the most. I love teachers, and I definitely love working with young students.
And Ingrid and I, you all probably know, we worked together for a couple years at Paces Connection. So got to experience that bigger picture when I was at Paces, and then came back to the school district, which I love bringing what I learned there into the new role. And Dr. Tyisha Noise, you are just on this podcast. So if people listen, they're like, that name sounds really familiar. But hey, you know what? Introduce yourself again and welcome back.
Good evening. I am Dr. Tyisha Noise. I'm ready to go into year 25 in education and human services. Feels strange to be, a quarter of a century into anything. But I had the privilege of coming into the work backwards. I started actually in mental health during a time where we were trying to figure out what to do when urban students were in a situation where they were getting expelled, right? They were behaving in ways that the only tool we had in our tool belt at the time was expulsion. And so big districts realized, they were like, well, what do we do? Like expelling kids and sending them to the next neighborhood school doesn't work. And so I got to come into the field sort of backwards, working with students who were on the verge of being put out of a district. And I learned from some amazing clinicians and program designers, right, how we could behave differently and create different kinds of environments for students in order to facilitate success. And I fell in love with the work there. And it took me sort of the long way around to becoming a teacher in special education and then an administrator. And becoming an administrator in an underserved community meant that I needed to bring every single thing I learned about addressing trauma and the needs of students and families with me into the seat. I had always taken it into the classroom, but as administrator, we just got so much better results when we were able to look through the lens of trauma-informed care and look through the lens of healing-centered experiences. And so it became my passion. It became what I focused on in my dissertation research. And it is something I still preach because it is one of the fundamental things I believe in about serving humans well, right? That we've got to care about more than just their compliance with what we want from them. We've got to care about their wholeness.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Noise. I'm going back to our conversation just a week ago. I don't know, a week or two ago. And man, as soon as I hear your voice, it starts making me think about that conversation. And if you all haven't listened to that podcast, please go back and listen to it. And of course, the other guests here, I've had episodes with them as well. Ingrid goes way back early on. I think it's like episode 7 of the 100. So it's been a long time ago. But anyway. And the last, but certainly not least, Julie Kurtz, not Katz. I once tagged her in LinkedIn as Julie Katz, and I don't know who Julie Katz really is, but she's probably appreciative of the work we do. But Julie Kurtz, welcome. Tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you, Matthew. It's wonderful to be here with everybody in the community that wants to give every child a voice and grow humane beings. And I think that's just become my mission and my mantra. I think it started as a little girl, right? Like, I just was trying to help myself, save myself. That's really all I cared about from my own trauma history and things that I'd been through, and then got into the helping field. And then lo and behold, just a beautiful gift of being able to be with these people in a room, with your network, with starting the Center for Optimal Brain Integration. And at the Center for Optimal Brain Integration, we do the same thing. I train all over the country on trauma and resilience and social emotional, from infancy all the way to the 12th grade. And my favorite thing to do is our training of trainers, where I believe we need to create sustainability in communities so that we grow the roots of people doing this work on their own. And so this is why we're all here today, because we all have this passion to make such a difference in giving every child a voice who's been impacted by trauma or toxic stress. So thank you.
It's interesting that the Trauma Informed Educators Network started as a genuine network of just trying to find people doing this work. And I think back to my very first episode with Jim Sporleader of this podcast, who has become a great friend of mine, how that I just was so nervous to reach out and ask him to be a guest on a podcast because I had never done a podcast. And now I hear Dr. Nicholson and Ingrid and Dr. Noise and Julie. I hear you're talking and thinking about the impact that this little network has been able to create in a ripple effect. And I think now more than ever, it's so important. And, I think as we discuss now, this idea of, there's so many conversations around the pandemic, and the pandemic absolutely blew the doors off of something that many educators were aware of before the pandemic. And that is that many schools, many places, and my school is one of them, we were trying to figure it out. And the way that we got into the work was what we were doing wasn't working. And I think it's really important that we have a discussion of why this book is so important now, but going back to before, what people have identified as the pandemic, as this shift that has happened, that it was before the pandemic. The pandemic exposed this situation of inequities, of lack of funding, of a lack of support in schools. So talk about that. And I'll start with you, Dr. Noise, because I know that you kind of had some thoughts before we came on, and then everybody else, please jump in. What are your thoughts around that? Around pre-pandemic, what was education like? And then for the rest of us, what it's like right now?
As somebody who's had the privilege of serving in the locale of the two largest school districts in the nation, right, that are sort of fraught with underserved, specifically urban communities, but I think the same may be true even in suburban or rural, right, underserved communities. There's two things you never have enough of in education, right? Time and money. And what does that mean? It means more than, we didn't get new uniforms or new books, right? It is, we don't have the money to provide the kind of training and time that educators need to sit together, right, and process and discuss the needs of students, to discuss their own needs, to care for each other, right, to build a sense of collective care, right? The way the teaching situation is set up, right, is in many places by contract, right? There's a certain number of hours you can have to do a certain set of things, and we're going to give you 75 things and 12 hours to do it in. Right. And so the time that we need as educators to sit together, to get to know each other, to build the kind of relationships, to create transformative experiences for students, we don't have it. And so in urban communities, right, that's even more true. And so we were looking at all these different kinds of trauma coming into urban schools before COVID, right, before whole families lost jobs and industries began to disappear literally before our eyes. Before that, right, we were short on time and money and therefore capacity, right? I watched whole school years go by where we're missing a teacher in a teacher line, and other teachers who have full loads of teaching are just subbing, right, in those blocks, just trying to pick up the slack for a whole missing human, right? Teachers were already stressed. We were already stretched too thin. We were already systemically asking for more, way more than we poured back into them. And I think COVID pulled the veil back on all of those things.
And for Julie and Julie, and even Ingrid, because I know you started in that early learning. I mean, I can see a major impact right now in early learning, right? And my experience isn't there. But what was the experience in early learning? I know in Tennessee, it's a relatively new idea, right? In the last 15 years, where early learning and pre-K are actually being put into schools and the importance of it. But what did you see in the field of early learning, really, pre-pandemic? And what were the areas of support and need?
Well, I know in my experience here in Tennessee, but also kind of the national view, is that there is a huge chasm of developmental delays when it comes to, post-COVID, that we have critical years in early learning. That time period from 0 to 6 is critical for brain development and social development. And as we have this kind of collectively traumatic experience that's not just impacting the actual learning experiences of children, but also the stress levels of their parents, of their caregivers, of the educators in their lives. Children are little emotional thermometers. They are very aware, even if they don't know the extent of what's going on in the environment. They are extremely aware of the level of stress that the adults around them are experiencing. And this has been extremely disruptive on a large scale, and will have ripples within our society for the next 10 to 15 years when it comes to kind of the developmental trauma and especially for those children who are not getting the support that they need in this critical time. And then the collective trauma of COVID compounded those issues because the access to the therapist and other practitioners was not there. And again, that critical time period, that small window where you can get a lot of recuperation out of a child, was missed. And so we don't know yet the implications of COVID when it comes to the early childhood realm. We will see fallout in that space for the next 10 to 15 years.
And I'll just add to that, Ingrid, thanks for bringing that up. I think most folks don't know that on average, our largest, we're talking a lot about chronic absenteeism and the fact that we have a lot of children and families who miss huge blocks of time in school, more so than ever before. And a lot of folks don't realize that the highest percentage often is with our kindergarten kids and even pre-K kids. And so when you think about, why is that? There's some research, showing that people coming through the pandemic have realized like, oh, well, we had options, we didn't have an option. People had to stay home in a lot of districts. In some districts, they had flexibility, but, and they have a very different orientation now to thinking about those early grades as an option. So that's one factor that's kind of different and interesting. But I think a lot of people said it doesn't feel aligned to what I want for my child at this age. And so it's kind of that question of, I don't know, that doesn't look developmentally informed. It doesn't look like a safe place for my child. And I think that there's a lot going on. I could go on. I won't go on about this, but I'll just say that one of the things, to your point, Matthew, is that we have now a whole system of early childhood that is linking to a public school system more than ever. And these systems have different histories. And we don't have principal training and teacher training on how to support a 3 and 4 and 5-year-old child developmentally. What we know supports them. And we have then just the push down of academics or, pedagogies that are okay for older children. We have them pushed down to younger children. We have that mapped against a fear of a learning gap. And so you have pedagogies that aren't aligned to how children learn. We have gaps for children's learning because of missed experiences and opportunities, that happened over the pandemic. And we have a fear of children needing to catch up. And so you have the perfect storm of pushing things on children they're not ready for and a lot of dysregulation. And so that's those systems. And I'll just say one other thing on top of that is that early childhood as a field, historically, the teachers have not been seen and recognized as professionals. They're thought of as babysitters, and they're not compensated. Our public school educators are not compensated anywhere near what they should be, but early childhood is even below that. So you have just these systems of stress, right, impacting and being absorbed everywhere and dysregulating. And so I agree with you, Ingrid, that we're going to see the impacts for years to come. Of course, we're trying to work on that and make a difference there, but that is, all those pieces are interacting.
I'll add something too. Today, what we know is under the age of 6, about half the kids in our country have experienced trauma. And that was true before the pandemic. That was the data before the pandemic. And the pandemic has just brought to light what we all knew before, but now everybody is facing and speaking to much more. And I'll say also a word of hope after I tell this one story of this conversation I had today with 6 mental health consultants who had a little girl under the age of 6 in their classroom, 3.9 years. And she's got so much trauma happening at home, and she's coming to school with a heart monitor on because she was fainting at home. And we know fight, flight, freeze. We even know fawn. But when our body can't handle the stress and the little immature nervous systems we have, we faint to shut down to survive. But I want to give some hope that out of Harvard, they say that children under the age of 6 are building 1 million new neural connections every second. And we have hope no matter what home they go home to, what stressors they have. Every minute we are with a child under the age of 6, since that's what we're speaking of, we have the power to rewire their brain and body. And the mental health consultants I talked to today started off with, we're giving them a notice of action to the family that we're going to. And at the end of the 1-hour conversation, it was like, oh, this is the trauma and the stress. So when we slow down and we give people time to reflect and we help people understand that trauma is being a navigator of the nervous system and helping people feel safer and more regulated, that opens up their ability to be able to feel engaged. And guess what? The good news is she's not passing out in the school and she feels safe there. And when I said that, they were like, oh, she must feel safe with us. Why is she not passing out in our school? And so I could go on, just like Julie and Ingrid could, about early childhood. So thank you for giving a platform for that, because a lot of people invisibilize early childhood.
Well, ironically, I was walking with the principal this morning through a school, and he's like, these are my pre-K. And I went, man, I love pre-K teachers. I mean, I love them. They're miracle workers when I watch them. And I'm going to shout out one of my old pre-K teachers, Miss Mary Brady, who had every little type of visual cue on her waist. And she would say whatever it was and give the visual cue. And just, it was amazing to me as a administrator not trained in early childhood to watch these very skilled educators building the brains of children who are just so malleable. We know all of them are, but we had 3-year-olds. So we had all the way down to 3-year-olds. But yes, huge shout out to our early childhood educators, because I couldn't do what you do. Even if I tried, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, let's talk about really quickly, we talked about a little bit pre-pandemic and we're talking about post-pandemic. And I will tell you, I genuinely thought, having stepped out of education for 2 years, not being actively, that I thought I understood, but I didn't. I didn't understand just where we are right now. And I will say, adults are hurting. Adults are overwhelmed. And I mean every adult, from district administrators to school administrators to teachers to paraprofessionals to office staff to parents who are walking in the door. It is a through line of stress. And one thing that we talk about in our book is the socio-ecological model and why this work is so important. And we're going to get to that, because this isn't just about the students. It's not just about the teachers. It's not just about the administrators. It's really about all of us and why this work is important. And what I see right now, and I'm seeing it happening across, because I like the rest of you, do consulting nationally. And I was just in upstate New York, and I was hearing that there's an idea of us versus them that's really permeating right now. It's the adult versus the kid. And the kids are doing this, and the kids are doing this, and the kids are doing this. And I'm always paused, and I'm saying, so let's talk through that. Why? Let's get to the why, right? And so I think that's part of it, is this universal dysregulation is creating divisions where there used to be natural connection in some places in classrooms and districts. And it's heartbreaking to me. Because as I say when I do keynotes, if you've ever heard me speak, I've never met an educator that when you ask, why did you get into education? Their response was, because I want to mess some kids up, right? That's not anyone. And nor is this the intent, but this is becoming the outcome that I'm seeing, is that we have dysregulated adults, not on purpose, right? Impacting kids in a way that is not what their intent is. And it doesn't matter what our intent is. It's the ultimate outcome of whatever it is that we're interacting with. And so I want to hear from you all, your current experiences, even within whatever field and eyes you're looking through, because even Dr. Nicholson, you being a professor, and Ingrid, you being a professor, I'm sure you're seeing this in the university level too. But what are you seeing in the current state of where we are? And we'll get to the socio-ecological model and why this book is so important as a resource for all the educators out there.
So what I will say that I'm seeing currently, especially from a national view, which I think is very interesting. I work with lots of different organizations through PACES as an individual consultant around lots of different issues in school settings. And so what I've noticed is that, I have groups that are really, they're doing the work. They are trauma informed, they're healing centered, and I have groups that are just getting started. And so with the groups that are doing the work, even they are very much expressing that they are overwhelmed, that the changes are so stark that they are really seeing what the kind of the waves from the pandemic and what the implications are in their students. I've had the words chaotic, used to talk about just, the environment, and that they are struggling. And one of the, and that they're looking for, they moved in a conscious, intentional way of moving towards healing modalities. And I think that is one of the opportunities that has come from COVID. It's that there is very clear interest in how we can incorporate healing modalities in the school setting that wasn't there before. And I greatly appreciate that, especially since it seems to be that there's a leaning towards incorporating communal and indigenous practices and cultural practices that are specific to healing, that I think, for one, our book has the potential to normalize that. And I think that is one of the things that is actually a good thing that has come out of this, that we are intentionally bringing in healing-centered modalities into the school setting that we maybe wouldn't before. And because there just has been a clear need. Everyone is aware that everyone is in need of healing and connection at this time.
Julie, Kurtz, I would also love to hear your perspective too when it comes to the science, right? With what you do through the Center of Optimal Brain Integration is really you're doing that connection of science and practice, and you're bringing a lot of that to our book. And shout out to you for being able to get that depth of the brain science. But talk about that. And when you're working with schools, how are you integrating that, right? And we all do. I'm just curious on how do you approach that when we're talking about dysregulated systems in adults, of getting them to be able to say, listen, we first have to understand ourselves before we can ever engage in regulating or co-regulating students. So what is your experience with that?
It's so interesting what Ingrid, you just said of, I wrote it down. You said, people are leaning into wanting to mobilize, but they're leaning in because they're stressed. Like before it was trauma and it was those kids and those people, but when we feel it, then we want to do something. So this universal dysregulation is mobilizing us more readily and more collectively. So getting back to what Mathew was asking is that now we all need help. So we have a big paradigm shift we have to make in education. We used to be, we have academics here, and then the parents are responsible for this. And now we have to shift to we are responsible for the whole child. And not only are we regulators and navigators of nervous systems, we are responsible to grow humane beings. And so it's not just at home, but it's at school. But I'll tell you one story, since I'm a storyteller, is that when adults are stressed, they are in their survival brain, and the part of their brain that usually fights, flights, or freeze. And so going back to my earlier conversation, the teachers in the meeting I had today were wanting to move towards kicking out because they were in their survival brain. An hour after talking and reflecting, they calmed down, and guess where they got? Access to their thinking and rational and prefrontal cortex, so they could say, oh, wait a minute, we see the light, we see all the things we could do. And so the last thing I'll say is that training all over the country, yeah, we're learning about brain science and we train on brain science, because then people go, oh, now I understand why I yell at my partner or spouse when I'm saying you're putting the dishes in the wrong way. That means I'm having a really hard day when I'm nagging about the way you put the forks in the dishwasher. Then we all see that this is not just about trauma. This is about stress. And that's what our book is about. And so, in summary, Nobody wants a trauma training without concrete strategies. But what I believe is that we hire people to do trainings to tell our teachers what to do with students. But if we're looking at this systemically, we also need to look at the adults looking at themselves, strengthening self-awareness and self-care. And then we need to look at the systems being trauma responsive and healing engaged. So it's a whole thing. It's just the point of entry when you get the phone call is, can you train my teachers? Then you train the teachers. Then as they build a relationship with you, you start to bring in all these other pieces. I'm gonna be quiet now.
No, and I want to piggyback off that and shout out to the Chester County Intermediate Unit that I've been working with for 2 years, because that's exactly it, right? And it comes down to when I've walked into schools that I've supported and they say students are this, students are that. The first thing I say is, so tell me about the adults. And there's a pause. Students aren't motivated, or students are they're frustrated, they're irritated. Tell me about the adults, right? Because it is that process, right? It's both, and it is dysregulated students can dysregulate regulated adults. We know that, right? But we also know that dysregulated adults can dysregulate regulated students. And so it goes both ways, and it is having these conversations, just like you said, Julie. People want just tell me the strategy. Well, a strategy without the understanding and mindset will not work, which is why, quote unquote, these programs that are packaged without the depth of understanding and building the knowledge of the adults and building those connections in the adults and the administrator understanding and supporting the adults in the same way they don't work in the long term, because a strategy without the understanding in the background and the self-regulation, right? It just doesn't build itself that way. Dr. Nicholson, what do you think?
Well, I'm thinking of a video. It was a series of videos that, for me, the OG, Dr. Bruce Perry, gave generously during the pandemic. I think they're probably still on YouTube, but he gave these short videos. And I remember during one, it was probably the one on state-dependent functioning. He introduced the idea of state-dependent regression. And he said the more that adults become dysregulated and the more the world around us becomes dysregulated, the more you're going to see. And he went into the whole description of what state-dependent regression looks like. And he said, I don't remember his exact words, but it was something to the effect of, as we continue through this experience, we're going to see more of this. We're going to see this with individuals. We're going to see it with schools, with organizations, with states, with nations. He said, we're going to see the state-dependent regression. So he gave examples, right? That people are going to be so stressed, they're going to not be capable of as much. Even really high-functioning folks who could do a lot and juggle a lot, they're going to find it frustrating because they're just not going to be able to do as much. They're going to need to partner to be as productive as they were before this. They're going to need, he said, people are going to read the world as threatening, and they're going to be more reactive. And you were just talking about that, Julie, that they're going to need that sort of moment of somebody who can say, I have empathy for where that's coming from, and say, let's take a step back and reframe. Let's imagine this through the lens of a child, or what might the parent be experiencing here? All that. He walked us through that. And I constantly think it was so helpful for me, because as I walk through the world now, I see that everywhere. And I see it through a lens of empathy. And I feel like when I'm in a regulated state, which we all have our dysregulated moments, but that I feel like it's my responsibility to be able to, through empathy, help people see that it's okay to break stuff down. I don't talk about doing PD now. I talk about micro learning, sometimes nano learning. Like, when I think about how I'm going to support a principal, it's like, what can I give them in 15 minutes? That's what we're going to do right now. I'm not going to let perfect get in the way of the good. That I'm going to think about how to not give people a 5-page something to read. I'm going to break it down to something real simple and clear, just as much as I can think about making things align to what people have available cognitively, how to pair people up, how to support people to feel successful so they feel effective in the work they do. because I just keep going back to that. We can do less because we're more stressed. And how do we work within that in a way that helps people feel good about what they do every day and not judging themselves against a standard that is no longer helpful?
You know, and interesting enough, our book talks about that with students and adults, right? Because I think sometimes we think because someone is of a certain age or has a certain qualification that stress doesn't impact them anymore. And from an administrator standpoint, I'm telling you, I've heard my colleagues say they're grown, they have degrees, they have to figure it out, right? We know now that's not working. And we know by what's called the teacher shortage. And I have all kinds of feelings of that term in it, using that as the term, because it's not a shortage, it's just a lack of appreciation and validation and affirmation and financial support, right? It's people are just not willing to do it anymore because that's what it is. But it comes down to just those same things that Julie Kurtz described and Dr. Nicholson and Ingrid, those impact us on the daily, right? And when you said that, Julie Kurtz, about putting the forks in incorrectly, I literally was like, I'm sitting in the congregation because that happened yesterday with my son. I kind of popped off sideways a little bit about something, and it had nothing to do with that. So even us that know, right, that it's still really hard work, and I want to validate how hard this work is. Mm-hmm. And it's a personal journey and a cultural journey in schools, right? This is people, and you might have heard on this podcast, I think it was my third or fourth year. Every year we had a mantra, and the third or fourth year was pre-forgiven. And that's because we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to be dysregulated and say something to another adult that shouldn't have been said. It was passive aggressive or just aggressive, right? We're going to handle a student in a way that we shouldn't have because we were frustrated. And that happens. That's life. But it's not the rupture that's the important part. It's the repair part, right? That's where relationships are strengthened. And even an example in our book, and I put the story in there, Julie, I'm a storyteller too, around one student who I raised my voice in the office towards because I thought she was about to do something, and she immediately froze. And I could tell her stress response was really high. And I had to, as an adult, apologize to the student. And I love this. I love that this happened. And I tell this story all the time because it was so impactful for me. Is this student who I call her grandma because she was only 8, but she was like an 80-year-old woman in an 8-year-old body. She would come to my office and say things like, "Ooh, your office is a mess." And I would say, "You are exactly right. It is." But I asked her I asked her to apologize to her. And I said, "Will you accept my apology?" And she said, "I'll think about it." And you know what? I appreciated that because she did not have to say yes. And she thought about it, and she left me a note later. And we put that example in the book, right? Because it's not about being perfect all the time. What you just said, Dr. Nicholson, it's not about getting it right all the time. And I make this statement often. If we wait to do something perfect every time in education, we will do nothing. Because I don't know anything that works every time, all the time, perfectly. It's constantly adjustments, right? Dr. Noise, what about your perspective in the second largest school district in the country and in your equity work that you're doing? What are you seeing this impact on adults and students?
I love this conversation. My original academic background is urban studies, right? How all of these things come together, right? Our understanding of development, right? Strength or challenge in the family system, community, how all of these things play together to create what we get. And I think our co-authors have created a powerful picture, right, of definitely what we're facing here in Los Angeles, but I'm sure in other places, right? And I want to shout out Dr. Nicholson because I got to sit through Keynotes How We Met of hers last year. And before I was going to be a teacher, I was going to be a therapist, right? So I have some background in psychology, and like that in working in mental health, you get a developmental lens, right? And it never occurred to me until listening to her, one, right, preschool, like we have a whole set of different ideals for what should happen with small children as we do for larger children, which I don't really understand because, you know, they're not transformers, right? They don't become cars and they were once something else, right? Between 6 and 7, right? Like life doesn't happen that way. But what occurs to me, even as we have this conversation, right, is how we get to the top of whatever that system is. So whether we're talking about high school students or college students, we send them into the work world and then we stop treating them like the humans that were on the same developmental scale, right? In a system, right? America is a capitalist system. And we have to sit with the idea that healing-centered and trauma-centered ideas are going to be complex for everybody who holds them, because we work in a system that is designed to get the most out of you while giving you the very least possible while I do it. Right. So whether we're talking about classrooms and students and teachers, or we're talking about the teacher to administrator, you know, I want you to take 5 hours of work home a day, right, while I only pay you for 6 or 7 hours a day, because that's what the kids need. And it's like, wait, no, I need a regulated human. I need regulated adults in a classroom with kids. And if I've got to work 12 hours a day and I can't take care of my own family, all you do is raise my stress, right? But it's literally as if when people become adults, we stop thinking of them as human, right? We think of them as some sort of product, or only as an employee, or only as something less than human, right? The way that we conceptualize, right, employment. And as I think about teaching and education and humans, right, I think about how this interplay of systems plays out in our schools, right? Teachers are not seen as humans who need regulation for themselves so they can regulate kids. So when they're frustrated, right, they look at parents and go, parents didn't do it, right? Because we don't get to see them as kids. I mean, as humans, right? Right. It's this, everybody's pointing the finger at some other human because this system has trained us that once you become an adult, you're not really as human as you were when you were a kid. You don't have the same kind of needs, right? But Maslow teaches us something different than that, right? The hierarchy in Maslow doesn't change whether you're a child at 3, child at 6, human at 20, or you're 45 or 80, right? Like the hierarchy of need doesn't change, right? And in fact, when I was doing my dissertation research, I remember realizing, right, that when Maslow first wrote about it, he called it the hierarchy of human motivation. Right? It wasn't just an issue of need. It was human motivation. How do we help people get to this next level we want them to be at? And I think he seats himself beautifully in Bronfenbrenner's system. In my dissertation work, I put them together because all of these things are playing out. We've got adults and parents who are stressed at jobs. We've got teachers, because we don't pay them enough, who work multiple jobs, right? They also manage families, parents who manage families, and right? And we're all in this system together, and nobody can afford to see anybody as human, right? Because if you are as human as I am, then I have to forgive you. I need to give you that grace. But here's the thing. I don't really know how to give that to myself. I didn't learn grace in this way for myself, right? Until I went to therapy, 20 years into the work. And so as we think about how we deliver, right, these ideas, right, to educators and administrators and whoever else we deliver them to, recognizing that we live in a system that is very counter to the idea that given the stress that we're under, we need to expect less but treat you better, right? Those two ideas feel opposite each other. But how do we make them work together? How do we create work? Right? Whether for teachers, for parents, for all the people who we care for, right? Supervise, manage, support, coach, all of the things. How do we do that? How do we create a system that does not take more than it gives, forgives us when we are dysregulated, and then has systems and tools in place to help me regulate when life, right? Because all the grown folks on here know that life will sneak up on you, pop up on you, surprise you, and dysregulate you even when you've done all your best work and used all your best tools. Life sometimes can still, right? And so I think this is a beautiful conversation, not just about schools, right, but about humans, right? How, and especially as a current administrator, right, how I care for the people who I'm responsible to lead. Right? Because leadership can no longer be about telling everybody what to do and then holding you accountable with a checklist. It has to be about us knowing who we work for, who we serve, why we serve them, and then how to get the best out of them. And if we are not trauma informed, healing centered, we will never get their best. And therefore, especially in education, we will never have given the best to the communities we serve.
You know what? I'm Dr. Noise. This is why I was thinking about our conversation last time you were on here, right? And when you say leadership, right, I don't hear administrator. I hear leadership as teachers, as everyone that's the leadership, because I think we all know that kids are no longer coming in just respecting educators, adults, as we were taught to do. And here's what I say. It's not a bad thing. It isn't a bad thing that kids are bringing their own self-advocacy, are seeing themselves as human, right? And wanting other people to see them as human. And when they feel disrespected, advocating for themselves when they're disrespected. It's not a bad thing. If you're looking at it through what Dr. Noise just said, from human to human, and you all know I live in Tennessee. I encounter people that do not think, believe, or even remotely have any comprehension of the things that I believe in, right? And I have had to challenge myself, as hard as it is, to approach people and see them as human first. It is hard, you all. But if we can't do it in the hard situations, then it's not any easier in those easy situations. And interesting enough, I was listening the week before spring break, I was in a school and I heard a child, and this child was very dysregulated, but was advocating in a way that was remarkable to me. He was just frustrated, and you could hear it. And he was saying, but you're not listening to me. You're not listening to what I'm saying to you. And guess what? They weren't. The adults were not listening. And he kept saying, but you're not listening to me. I'm telling you. And they weren't. And I could hear the frustration coming from the adult too. And I could feel this escalated situation, which when I'm somebody that's there to support, it's so hard not to jump in the middle of those situations and say, hey, can we chat for just a second? Right? It's so hard, but having those post conversations are great, right? Like, let's talk about what happened there. But there's this yearning right now for people who continually are feeling disrespected, and it's going in every ring of that sociological model, right? I hear constantly, kids aren't being respectful. Kids aren't being respectful. I hear from kids, adults just aren't being respectful, right? And so I think once we're talking about this book, we're talking about all these layers and how, like Dr. Noise said, this isn't about one individual. It's not about the teacher. It's not about the kids. It's not about the administrator. This is really about creating systems that involve everyone, that we can see a brighter future of what we know schools can be. And how do I know? Because I was in one that was on this journey. Did we have it all figured out? Absolutely not. Did we do it perfectly? Not even close. But what we're seeing those wins, and did I get to go back just a couple weeks ago and embrace a child who, yes, I embraced them in a big old hug, right? A big old hug. A child that I won't even describe because it's not fair to him and it's not my story to tell, that struggled just walking into the school every single day. This child now has ownership of his job that he does every day. He has ownership of when he's frustrated or is feeling disrespected and all those things. He has a place to go to. He talks through it. He comes up with the solution and he walks back, right? If you would have told me that 5 years ago when he first came to the school I led, I would have told you, I don't know. But it happens. And that's why we are so passionate, is we've been in this work, we've seen this work, and we know there is a future and a hope in this work. So what is the future? What is the hope that you all, because we bring a lot, you all, in this book. And I went through, and boy, this editing process has been something, hasn't it, you all? And I know Julie and Julie have written multiple books. I have not. But watching how we have to cut down and take things out and how important things are, but we're bringing hope. And I think that's the key of what we need right now. We need strategies, yes. We need a mind shift, yes. And I might have just said another word, and that might have been Freudian slip. but we need we've got to have hope in this. And so talk about a little bit of that. Why you think this approach that we've spent so much time developing and building and on our own experiences, why is this the future? Why is this what we see education to be in the future? Not all at once.
Well, I always want to give space, but for me, I think, again, kind of the icing on the cake in this situation is that we get to really examine what healing looks like in an educational setting in a real way. And so I am very excited about the social ecological model, and I'm excited to really broaden the audience for the Rise Center's work in their interacting layers of healing and trauma. And I think that one of the things that's going to come out of this is hopefully we will normalize what it means to be culturally responsive to children and adults, that allows for them to have their own healing experiences within our educational system. Our educational system is Eurocentric. They tell stories and they affirm white history. We have a huge gap there for children of color to feel a real sense of belonging within their school system, that their school system caters to them, that their school system is there to educate them in a way that is multifaceted beyond what we have in the past. I think we have an opportunity to normalize healing modalities that are rooted in other cultural experiences. And especially if we bring in PCEs, as we're thinking about kind of this emerging science of how we can craft positive experiences with adults being in the space of meaning making and allowing children to have this third party that's not a parent to be in the space to let them express themselves. And if we can do that in a culturally relevant manner, then that will be something that I think is going to be the future of education. It is very different than the way we've operated currently. And it has left a huge hole in many different ways, especially around identity, how children see themselves. Do they see themselves fitting within our society as they go to school? And many children do not. And that means that we've had the stress and trauma of othering, whole swaths of communities. What does it mean to heal that? That means we need to integrate their stories into our educational experience, and that's going to be healing for them. And I hope that that's one thing that comes away from this book.
I think I'll add something here, and that is what I have loved about the work I feel like we are privileged to do is that not only are we capturing stories from all these amazing humans that I'm sharing this space with, but what we love to do is to go out and talk to teachers and administrators all over the country and shine a light on what they're doing every day in the midst of all that stress and the system that is set up to take more from them than to nourish them with. And they are doing amazing things and things that we're able to capture that don't cost a lot of money or require fidelity to a PD, structure for a year. Just right. Teachers who are finding hope, finding agency, finding opportunities for, as Bruce Perry says, like every interaction is an opportunity for intervention. Right. And they are doing that. And so I will just tee up one story, and I know Julie and others, share. We should just kind of share some of the wisdom, some of the brilliance. But one of the things that I love is seeing, and I see this not only in this context of being a book author, but in the context of being a parent of 3 children. I see that there is a shift, a paradigm shift happening where it is okay and being normalized to talk about the human experience of emotion, and that we experience a lot of different emotions and that is part of our experience that doesn't have to be shamed and hidden, and you don't have to walk through a door and say, I'm checking that part of me at home, or I have to hide that and grow into places of shame and self-doubt because something's going on and I'm not allowed to reveal it here. But I see that we're supporting teachers and pre-K all the way up to have ways of giving students agency to name, to build a vocabulary, and not just the kids, the teachers and the adults in the buildings too, to build a vocabulary for naming what is happening in their bodies all throughout the day. And then to say, not only can we make this visible and normalize this as something that is part of our human experience, but you're not alone in feeling overwhelmed when you're activated. There's things we can do, and we can practice those things. And we can practice those things in the context of school, because that helps regulate you so you can learn. And so my story, that I share often, I just love this story so much, came from an educator here in the Bay Area, with an educator being a childcare center. And one of the little boys, who was probably 4, was being dropped off. And he didn't want his caregiver to go, his parent. And he broke down in tears. And what happened in that classroom was not, you need to have a timeout or get yourself together, or, all those things that we could imagine that aren't helpful. What happened in this context was, it was humanizing. And another peer came running up to him and said, let's do the breathing ball together, and held the ball. Let's breathe. Take a breath. And now exhale. Inhale and exhale. And I'm here with you. I see that you're sad, and there's stuff we can do. You're not alone. I got your back, and we're going to breathe together. Like, that's beautiful. But that ball was there. He had been taught to use it. It's a strategy, and he's not alone. And I think if we can normalize that we're going to be in these different states, and we're going to dysregulate, and there's things you can do, and you don't have to do it alone, I just think that's an amazing start.
I love that. I just love what you just said, because normalizing emotions, because historically in this country, we have told kids when they have anything other than happy and compliant that we will start to shame, blame, criticize. We as the adult have the voice, what's wrong with you? And the trajectory of our reactions that come from that voice is bribery and blaming and shaming. And now we've got all these kids that don't know what to do with these varying feelings. And acting out is just communication when I don't have the words. And so what if we as schools taught that? And what I love about our book is that we have interviewed people all over the country who are implementing these practices. You don't need to use the word trauma. We're going to use the word toxic stress. No matter what we're experiencing, trauma-informed practices is not about being nice. It is about helping students regulate their nervous system so they can think more clearly. And I'll give one example from our book that is Michael Lang, who's a 7th grade, I think he's 7th, 8th math teacher in far Northern California. And every morning, because he understands this work, he understands we're navigators of the nervous system. Every morning the kids arrive, and he has a little chart that says, begin your day with one of these mindfulness movement activities. And you have a choice. It could be meditation, the stretching category, the math fun activity, the gardening, the reading, the walking, the journaling, the art video, the audiobook. You get to pick, and you get 15, 20 minutes to slowly move your body in and regulate. And the kids are so much more grounded and regulated. And this is just one of many stories of teachers that are implementing these practices, like Teresa Manning, who says it used to take the kids 40 minutes to regulate. Now we're down to 15 because of all the strategies that we've highlighted of her in our book. So it's going to be a book that's concrete, real stories and real strategies of what this looks like.
Oh, you all, I'm so excited. I can't wait for people to be able to get to this. And someone just asked, what is the name of the book? Stay tuned. We're not quite there yet, but you just heard what all is going to be in it. And I have to say, too, that what you just described are practices that are widely used, right? And getting major success. They were used in my school. And I will tell you that if you're like, but that sounds too woo woo, right? Here's what I tell people. It's breathing, y'all. It's breathing. We're just teaching kids to use breath as a regulating tool, because we know, and I had a great guest on here not too long ago that actually did 5 minutes of guided breathing on the podcast. And I now use it when I go to schools, and it's how I end my day. And it's amazing what it does when we use that tool, right? And I also have learned that when we, and I say we because I'm including myself, when we haven't done our own work to be able to understand our own selves and our own regulation and our own ability to do these things, it seems like something that is we don't want to do. And I want to push people to be able to look at themselves, in the words of Michael Jackson, the man in the mirror, right? We have to stop at some point and begin to reflect on ourselves and our own practices and what we do. Because it's much easier when we're projecting what we want others to do when we're unwilling to do some of those things ourselves. And I say that because as a principal, when I first started as a principal, I was not a trauma-informed principal. I was doing what I thought principaling should be, and I wasn't treating kids the way that they should be treated as humans, little humans, right? Humans in general. I wasn't treating the adults necessarily the way that they should be treated. And I thought that's what principling was. And I think going back to what Dr. Noise said at the very beginning about the systems in which we're operating by design, and Ingrid has said this many times, we can't talk about the systems as something that we're not a part of. We are all part of it, right? We have to begin to unravel some of those pieces on why do we do what we do? And when you realize, wow, why I'm doing that to kids is about compliance, getting them to do what I'm telling them to do, right? And we know it's not applicable to education. It does not breed a ground of learning. It doesn't open up someone's ability to be able to process complex and hard things. We know that we have to be in a state in which we are able to do the things we want kids to do. It doesn't just happen because they walk through a door of a school. And some of the things we talk about is, what do you do at the door of the school, right? How do we build regulated systems and structures before kids even walk through the door? And we talk about, okay, well, now they're in the door. What are things we can do when we're in the school, right? What can we do with adults? How do we problem solve when there's a problem? I learned that as a principal, and now coaching principals, there's this idea that if there's a problem, if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. It's something that happens, right? And I've learned that isn't the case. It actually just gets bigger, and it turns into something that is toxic, and in a culture, it's toxic, right? So we even have systems on what do we do in schools when there is something that is building in the school, and how do we solve those problems? You all, this is really important work, and many of you are doing it. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably doing it. And I will tell you what Dr. Nicholson said, and that is, we've talked to people around the country who are also doing it. So you might be what I call the choir or the congregation, right? You might be like, yes, but I promise you there's ideas in here in this book. There's people's stories that are going to resonate with you and shift that. It's not about changing everyone's mindset drastically. Some of us just need a little tweak here and there. Wow, that made me think differently. It's why I do the podcast, right? It's why I do this, so I can talk to people and get that little tweak that makes me think, I've got to think deeper about that. But as we move on, right? Tell me what you all, let's get into our own personal excitements, because we have about 20 minutes or so. What are you most excited about? What piece of this resource that we're producing and put so many hours and so much love and so much time into, what are you the most excited about for readers to be able to get access to?
For me, it's very full circle. I can go back to, like, I'm a person who writes goals every couple of years and all of that kind of stuff. But I remember the first time after working with a student for, a little over a year, my very first job out of college, we had a non-public school, a latency program for kids who were in danger of being removed. And an early childhood program for young people who had been exited from multiple preschools. And I remember the first time we got to support a student well enough for them to develop the kind of coping skills that allowed them to go back to general education school. And I remember being in that moment and thinking, if every teacher knew what I knew, that everything would change. And I feel like I've spent my career in a lot of different ways trying to help people understand the kinds of things we're talking about now. And so for me, I'm excited because I get to stand in this moment where literally that is what is happening. We are folks who understand brain integration and child development and how to create and cultivate the kind of environments that allow humans, not just the little ones, all the humans to thrive. We get to share that experience. From the earlier comment, I also want to add, I want to invite administrators and district level leaders into this conversation, right? In building a trauma sensitive, healing centered environment. Do not, if of all the things you're going to abdicate and delegate, let this not be the thing you abdicate and delegate, not only because you need to set the example, but because it will change the way you lead. I came in trauma sensitive to kids. That I understood. I had to learn it with adults. But I can tell you today that I have teachers who I used to supervise who were talking to supervise their current supervisors like, when Noise was here, I didn't have this problem. When Noise was here, she understood. I heard somebody quote a conversation to me recently, and they were like, somebody told me there was a conversation they're supervised by obviously somebody who is not me. And a former coworker said to them, Noise spoiled you. And the teacher responded, no, she treated me like an adult. Now, I want to contextualize. This was a teacher who I was with her while she was raising a teenager with a parent with Parkinson's. I was with her as her supervisor when she lost her mother. I was her friend still when she lost her father 7 years later. We walked through those things together, right? And she was able to do her best work and her best humaning, right? As a parent, as a mom, as a daughter, because we made an agreement that we were going to see each other as humans, that we were going to relate that way. I was going to give her everything I could to help her navigate that. And in turn, she also gave students the best of herself that was available at that time. Not only do I still have that relationship, but we're still talking about it, right? Like I just had this conversation in the last 6 months. And so for me, the world that I dream of, I feel like starts right here, starts with the work that we are talking about. Us being able to all see each other as humans with needs and values and experiences that we may or may not understand, but that we can find and choose empathy for and walk with people through.
I'll build from that in responding here. So one of the things that I am really excited about, I found in the work, I've been doing this work for 20 some years, right? I find that one of the hardest learning edges for folks everywhere, not just educators, is it's not empathy versus accountability, right? That's a bifurcation that is a false one, but it has to do with our mindsets, our taken for granted assumptions. And so the idea that, we have to break through that. We have to help people. You talk about this, Mathew, as a paradigm shift. And one of the things that I have loved is capturing stories that help us unlearn those assumptions and relearn the why we do what we do, why we relate as humans to children and to adults, to have that connection, to help them ground themselves if they're dysregulated, to come back to calm or to stay calm and to feel like they can be their best selves. We're doing that so that we can support students to learn. We're doing that so we can be our best as teachers, live into our values as administrators. And the stories that we can capture show that in action. And that's beautiful because it's hard work to explain that to folks because we're changing long held assumptions, right? That to be accountable, to have outcomes is to somehow, I don't know, not have empathy, or I don't know, to yell at the dysregulated person or be firm or come down hard on the compliance piece, when in fact that just dysregulates further. But helping people see what it looks like to have empathy and be accountable and support learning to the, at a level of thrivance. Like that's what we need, are stories that help them get there. And I feel like it does that. One last thing I'll say I'm excited about is that it's a strength-based approach, because everybody who looks at these stories, because they come from the field, everybody is going to be able to take a look at a story and say, oh, that's so great, I'm doing that. There's going to be an affirmation of things that you're already doing, and we can grow into learning new strategies when we feel like we're being affirmed for some of the stuff we're already doing well, right? So it's a both and.
I mean, I think for me, mine is really close to Dr. Nicholson. I am really looking forward to the narrative shift. Most of my work is in the South and in the Midwest, and Matthew, we live in Nashville, Tennessee, and so there are so many myths around trauma-informed practices in schools, and just in education in general. There's the myth of scientific racism, the myth of behaviorism. Like there's so many beliefs that are held around education and children that are just not true. And so I hope that those who read this book can see, when we talk about humanizing children, we talk about this from the lens of brain science. We talk about this is how the human body works. And it goes against many of the things that we've been taught within our society. And so I think those type of revelations that people can have are like, oh, this is not the case. This is very different from the way that I've been taught, or the way that I've been raised, or the way that I raise my own children. And hopefully they can experiment, try it out, see what happens, and they get to see that they'll probably get better results in those moments because they are slowing down, being mindful, taking the time, seeing people as human beings, not falling for the narratives around gender expression, race, poverty, and all the other, all the isms that we have in our society. I often talk about how one of the critiques I have around trauma-informed schools is that I think that it's not the space, that the schools aren't the where all of the fixing needs to happen, that these are societal issues. Schools are a microcosm of our larger society. We have, very large, impactful systems that schools are kind of being blamed for, but then definitely are taking on the responsibility of addressing. And so having teachers in a between a rock and a hard place, while also leaning on outdated or just just things that are just not true around the human body and how we behave and how children are and who they are, I think hopefully this book can help people to actually put things in place that will work for them to connect with children, that will then lead to the outcomes that they're looking for. Because they, I believe that teachers are well-intentioned, teachers and administrators. They are really, doubling down on beliefs that are just based in, again, kind of what Dr. Noise said, this capitalist system of productivity, and our worth is tied to our performance as opposed to our inherent humanness. As we get away from that, people are going to be able to see that it's really going to get them the outcomes that they're looking for. And I think that that's what I'm most excited about. That's what I really want to see.
Wow. I'll close with just a few thoughts, building upon what all of you said. That paradigm shift is so hard, because I just remember I used to make my bed every day because my mother told me I had to make my bed every day. And then one day somebody said, why do you make your bed every day? And I was like, I don't know. And from that day forward, I don't make my bed anymore unless someone comes over. Why am I telling this story? Because we develop these values and perceptions and beliefs about, if kids are having any dysregulated behavior, we should punish, blame, shame, criticize, expel, or give stickers or whatever it is. And we have always done it that way. And what I love about our book is it's making visible the paradigm shift that I believe our entire society will make over time, and changing the ship is hard. I'm going to close with just one. I mean, I'll say first that the limbic brain is wired for connection. We are neurobiologically wired for connection. That's why we're a part of tribes and relationships, because Dr. Bruce Perry says we don't have armor, so we need to protect ourselves with the tribes that we're in. But the more stressed we are, the more we become tribal and other and isms. And when we make that transparent, we can start to reduce that and be more accepting of others that are different from us. But I'll just close with one story, Matthew. I want to just share this one story, working with a juvenile justice program, and they had so many dysregulated behaviors. And all the work we did was with the teachers. Yeah, understanding trauma-informed practices, but as soon as the teachers started to get along and have each other's back and reduce their stress, there was about a year into this work, they said, we don't need you anymore, Julie. And my question was why? Like, of course I want no one to need me anymore, but why? We don't have as many dysregulated behaviors in our program. And it was all about the teachers. And we'll see so many of these transparent stories in our book. So I'm really, really excited for that.
Oh, I'm excited on every level, but I go back to thinking about how this network was started, the Trauma Informed Educators Network. And it was really started by me meeting people who were exploring or already have discovered this work, right? That's how the Trauma Informed Educators Network group started, was me searching for people and not knowing that there would be thousands, 35,000 other people looking for people doing this work, right? And then I think about this podcast and how that this podcast really was, again, about my own learning selfishly, right? I wanted to learn from people, not knowing there would be hundreds of thousands of people across the globe that would also want to learn what I'm learning, right? And then the experiences that I have with being an administrator and being a human and having the privilege of being in a school that I was in, and it was a privilege that I was there. But to me, this is honoring every adult that I work next to, every kid that I got to encounter. It is about them, because it's not about me. This is just the vessel of me being able to have an opportunity to share what they taught me, because I've said this 1,000 times. I think most of the kids that I've interacted with have probably taught me more than I probably have taught them. And I walk away in those relationships going, and I'm getting choked up thinking about specific students that taught me so much by just being them, and being able to see that there are thousands of kids that are similar to them, right? But yet so unique each individual, and how that what we're doing to kids isn't what we should be doing with kids, and how that we have been sold a bill of goods that is not true, that we have been told that these practices are what you do, knowing now that it isn't true, that how we treat kids is really inhumane. And I go back to Ingrid and I did when we were podcasting together, we did a podcast about how child abuse is normalized in our country. And by that, I mean the inhumane treatment of children. And there were laws against the treatment of animals before there were the laws against the treatment of kids. And how that's perpetuated day to day by these misinformed, right? We, in the words of Maya Angelou, we do what we know, and we know better, we do better. This is knowing better. And it's not shame. I wasn't doing it I wasn't being a principal the way that I now know I should have been. I don't necessarily feel shame for that, right? But I look back and go, man, I wish I would have known differently. And I've had to go back and repair some relationships with kids that were there my first year. And I've had to have conversations with parents, right? But then I also go back and I look at the kids that were there while we were doing the work, and I'm seeing them thrive. And just 2 weeks ago, I had a principal. She was a teacher. She was on this podcast. She wrote a book called The First Year Teacher, and it's here somewhere, and I'll find it before we close. She said, "Can we meet?" And I said, "Sure." And the conversation, the authentic human conversation that we had, took me back to a time we had a disagreement where she was yelling at me in a team meeting. And I remember telling myself, you have to stay regulated, because I was absolutely activated. And I said, I'm not going to have this conversation right now. Let's talk afterwards. And that was probably the strongest thing that we experienced. And it was hard, but we became closer because of it. Because as an administrator, my first initial thought wasn't, well, she disrespected me. My first initial thought was, something's behind that. There's something happening. And so when she came in, I said, what's up? That's not, I know something's up. And that was the case. And see, when we treat each other like human beings, right, from kids to adults to our peers, and what Julie said is so key. If we don't have each other's back, being an educator right now is virtually impossible. If you're not on a team and you're not in a school where people have your back, this work is virtually impossible. When we are providing a tool now that can help build this culture that we want to see, and we've experienced, many of us, because that is the future of this work. It is the future of education. And there are naysayers, and I'm starting to see some popping up saying that all this work it's snake oil, it's ridiculous. Some of the people who have been on this podcast have been attacked on social media in the last 2 weeks, including Dr. Lori Desautel's, including Joe Brummer, about their work, from an administrator saying that this is all hogwash, right? We have to be honest with ourselves and say, this is hard work. And for the educators who are out there, and the educators that buy this book, know that you can be. People say the systems have to change. I believe that at one time, but I also believe we can be part of the change of the system that we're in, and pushing that change. Look where we are. Look, I tell people all the time, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be writing a book with a remarkable, unbelievably gifted, and a team for Harvard Education Press, I would have called you a liar. One, if you would have told me that a little video that was done at the school that I was leading had been shared millions of times, and we didn't even have it right, I would have called you a liar. Right. But what we were doing as a school and as a team was moving forward in what we knew was right. And that's what this next step of this book is moving us in this direction of what we know is right. So you all, we have just a few minutes. I'm going to give each of you, I always ask the same question, and I probably asked you, except for maybe Ingrid, way back 93 episodes ago, or however many it was. I probably didn't ask this question, but I've asked it since then. And I've asked the other three on here in the last couple months. But what do you want educators to know from you right now? That's called think time in education, by the way. Check that on my rubric.
I believe, and this is indirectly related to the book, but I think what I would want educators to know from me right now is how important it is that they self-advocate. That, in both spaces, on the outside looking into the school system where I am now, but even in the past when I was in family engagement, and I was working in a space that was kind of in the middle between families and the schools, to kind of be essentially a translator or a connector between families and schools. The school system is a system. I'm a critic of the school system as it is now. I don't shy away from that. And what I think should be taken away is that teachers, administrators as well, but especially teachers, really need to engage in self-advocacy. That, the situation and kind of what Julie Nicholson talked about before, especially pre-K teachers, when, again, they get paid so little when their work is so impactful across the lifespan. pay, conditions, stress, work environment, having an impact on your health, on your relationships. Self-advocacy is one tool that you have against this larger system that I think that you should employ, especially since those who are the forces that are not exactly in alignment with you are very well, they have messaging, they're coordinated. And so teachers should be as well.
I'll go next. Okay. So I remember it because it wasn't that long ago, what I said when I was on the podcast last time. And I'm going to go in a slightly different direction today and share a quote from Letters to a Young Poet. I shared this earlier this week in a different presentation. Let me read the quote and then I'll tell you why I chose it. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. And I share that because there's so many questions right now about how we're going to keep going in the midst of so much stress. How are we going to staff our schools with teachers and administrators? How are we going to help children who are experiencing so much toxic stress and trauma? We could go on and on. There's so many questions. How am I going to take risks to be trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive in the context of a school district where administrators are like the ones writing on the social media, calling this a bunch of baloney? How am I going to do any of that? There's a lot of questions. And I have found that it can be very overwhelming to have to find the answer and know what that answer is going to be. For me, I have found that if I can find at least one other person who's willing to be with me, to lean in and just take every day, wake up, take a breath, be thankful for the breath I have, and just keep moving forward with, in my sphere of influence, what I can do today to make a difference, given my vision, and just hold space for the question, because I don't know what the journey is going to be. I know that I have the question. I know I have the mission. I know I have the partner. I'm not alone. And just being in that space brings so much liberation, so much inspiration for continuing forward with a lot of uncertainty.
It's too hard for me to add anything in less than 25 million words. So I'm just going to say thank you to everybody out there. I know at the 50,000 foot level that when we are in a crisis, which we are in our educational system, it's being manifest through stress. Crisis then brings change. And I believe this book is coming out at the exact moment we need a beacon of light and hope to see and map out what that might look like. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of it.
I have three pretty simple thoughts. To echo Dr. Nicholson, first and foremost, you are not alone. I know this is hard. We know this is hard. We do not sit here on a perch as some sort of experts, right? Talking from a castle. I was on the ground as a principal just up until a year ago. You are not alone in a desire to create the best possible experiences for children and to be healthy while you do it. You are not alone. You are appreciated for the monumental task ahead of you and that you have poured your heart and soul into every single day that you have been in the classroom with children. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the work you do. As a little girl from South Central LA, whose greatest opportunities in life came because teachers saw me and gave me what I needed, you are appreciated. And every day in a room when you love kids matters. And finally, you are necessary. If there's any way to stay in the field, please don't quit. We need you. Our children need you. Your communities need you. The families need you. But the world needs you. The world needs what you pour into children so they can become happy, healthy, well-adjusted, intellectual beings who can contribute their gifts to the world. To echo Julie Kurtz, thank you so much for what you do. You are loved, you are cared for, you are necessary, and you are appreciated.
Man, I'm going to go use the 1990s phrase, ditto, right? For those of you 90 kids out there, you know what ditto means. For those of you who are not, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but there's a powerful thing called Google, and you can Google that. But I agree. And I have to say, it's hard, y'all. It's hard. It's hard work. But I also will say I've never been in a year of education that isn't hard. My first year teaching was hard. My second year teaching was hard. My first year as a principal was hard. My seventh year as a principal was hard. It's hard work, right? And I also, again, you can hold yourselves as well. It's okay to disconnect in love. From my friend Dana Thomas at the Happy Teacher Revolution, I took that to heart. It's okay to disconnect in love. You can still stop for a moment for yourself, right? And I encourage you to do that, right? Disconnect in love, stop for yourself, be there for your family. I told my co-authors here, the reason I have a hat on, I was literally running from my child's soccer game because I vowed I'm not going to miss any more of those opportunities that I have with my own family. And I ran there and I came straight here, and then I'm about to run to his track meet. Yes, he does all those things voluntarily. It is not forced. But I love seeing him be himself and do what he loves to do. And as we close today, we will tell you this will hopefully be out in the spring of 2025-ish at some point. We are working hard. That may come out earlier or later, but at some point you will have this book, and we will make sure we share it. And also, as this is the 100th episode of the Trauma Informed Education guests that we've had, one of the early on, Dr. Bruce Perry and colleague A. Rowland, she wrote the book Dear First Year Teacher. If you haven't got it, get it. All of her experiences in there from when she was at my school. So I loved reading it. Dr. Tracy Benson from Unconscious Bias in Schools. Thank you for being on here, and you've been on here a couple of times. You changed my thinking in a matter of an episode. I also have Dr. Lourdes Alvarez Ortiz. You came on here and talked about your amazing work. My very first guest, Jim Store Leader, who wrote the original The Trauma Informed Schools Guidebook. He became a mentor of mine for many, many years. He still is a friend. And I have to say this to him. Happy retirement, Jim. He is retiring this year, and I feel like there's a group of us that have to carry that torch for him as you referred, Julie, the OG of trauma-informed education with his documentary, Paper Tigers, and his work at Walla Walla. Joe Brummer has been on here before. He is a great friend of mine. He has a brand new book coming out. Dr. Mona Delahook. If you don't know Dr. Mona Delahook's story, she's been through a lot. She had an aneurysm just about a year ago, and she is back. Her first post, I remember those feelings I had in my body I was excited and exuberated to see her back from such an unbelievable health crisis. But she's still back in the work. And y'all, I've got a few more, so hang with me. Zaretta Hammond was on here. And again, another person who bent my thinking in ways that I needed to have. And shout out to her for being an unapologetic disruptor. I love that I'm holding a book that's spanned of like 5 different things. But we're going to keep doing this work Loretta, just as you are. Just recently, Ginger Healy's book, right? This is an awesome little resource too. Shout out to Ginger, friend of mine. This is actually the workbook. She has another book that goes along with this. Another great friend of mine, and I call her one of the original Trauma Informed Educators Network folks. Alex Chevron-Vanette wrote Equity Center Trauma Informed Education, and we mentioned this book in our book. Shout out to you, Alex. You were early on in the network, one of our members and contributing and sharing often, and honestly, one of our team members that helped us go on to the conference for the very first couple of years. So thank you for all you've done for this work, especially in our thinking around the ACE study. If you haven't read this book, read it. It's interesting how she been my thinking around the ACE study and how it isn't exactly what we always thought it was. This book, Dr. Lori Desautel's, she's been on here twice. Shout out to Dr. Lori, great friend of mine. We've literally been across the globe with each other. And in Australia last year, we got to hang out, and we get to do it again this year with our friend Joe. And then lastly, again, Dr. Bruce Perry for coming back on after his other book, What Happened to You. As Julie Nicholson said, we appreciate the work that he has done in this field of trauma-informed work and the push of that work. So you all, thank you so much for listening to the 100th episode of the podcast. And one last thing I want to remind you, and I told you last week, I'm launching a new podcast. And it's interesting because I think Julie Kurtz touched on this. It's about our own healing journey. My dad and I are actually joining together in a podcast of life-changing work for us. And this podcast is really about his experience that has impacted all of us. It's called Leave the Light On. It's his story of war and his internal battle. And he has only told me his story of being wounded, drafted and wounded in Vietnam one time in my entire life, and he was going to tell it again. And so I hope you join. I'm going to be recording the very first episode this week. I know it's Thursday, maybe next week. But we're going to be going through that journey of healing together as a tool for other people, other veterans who are out there, and children of veterans who trying to understand what PTSD really has an impact on generations, not just those who are impacted by the war directly, but their families. But stay tuned for that. And as always, please, 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 please go into the world and do something awesome. All right, you all. Thank you to all of you who are still on the live stream. Appreciate you, and for all of you who are commenting. Oh, there's my dad. Oh my gosh, my dad just commented. See, Dad, I told you I was going to talk about our podcast. Cool. Hey, there he is. Look at this. There he is. See, I love this. This is cool.
Hi, Dad. Thanks for being you, raising this son.
He could tell you some stories. I'm going to tell you right now. When I tell you I was the kid people didn't want in their class, he could tell you. We talked about it actually just recently. But Dad, thanks for being on here. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it. But for all of you, also Mitchell and Shari and Ginger and Whit. I think it's Whit and Beth. I actually recognize your name now, Catherine. And so many others that were on here live. You all, to have nearly 50 people just join us live is huge for this little podcast that streams. And most of our listens come from podcasts. So thank you all. I will be back next week with another amazing guest. So she has created a regulation tool for kids, and it oddly looks like me. For real, it does. You just have to come back next Monday and see this awesome regulation tool that looks like me. So thank you all again for being a part of this network, for listening. And as always, please, 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 please give us a review and a share, because those reviews just allow us to go up those accessibility charts for people to hear more about the work that we all have invested our love, heart, sweat, and tears into. So if you could give a review, it only takes a few minutes, whatever platform you listen to, that would be awesome. And we hope you have a great rest of the week. This is a long weekend for some of us, so I will be chilling at my cabin with no internet or cell phone service starting Friday, and I can't wait. So, and a huge shout out to my friends, my guests, my co-authors for being on here tonight and giving up their time. And we can't wait to see you all once the book comes out to share our experiences, our stories, and our support for you as we navigate this work together. So have a great night. For the guests, if you'll just give me 1 second. And thank you all for being on. Appreciate it.
Thank you.